Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to the American frontier of the 1860s and 1870s, to the dust and leather and impossible distances of the stagecoach era, where the men who drove the coaches were the lifeline between isolated settlements, carrying mail and passengers, and gossip across hundreds of miles of territory that could kill you 6 different ways before breakfast. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you. But only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to the frontier. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know why a stagecoach driver named Charlie Parkhurst kept a secret for 56 years, why frontier men called certain drivers bachelor boys, and meant something very specific by it, and what was really happening in those relay stations where drivers slept 2 to a bunk. Congratulations! You have just woken up in the American West. The year is 1867. The sun has not come up yet, but you can already feel it waiting, coiled and mean, somewhere beyond the mountains. The air smells like sagebrush and horse manure, and the particular kind of dust that gets into everything. Your boots, your teeth, the seams of your leather gloves. Someone nearby is swearing at a mule. Someone else is boiling coffee that could strip paint. Welcome. You are standing outside a relay station in Nevada territory. The building is rough pine logs, chinked with mud. There is a barn that leans slightly to the left. There is a corral with a dozen horses that look like they have opinions about being awake this early. And there is a stagecoach, a massive Concord coach built in New Hampshire and shipped out here at extraordinary expense, painted red and yellow, swaying slightly on its leather thoroughbraces like a ship at anchor. In about 10 minutes, that coach is going to leave for the next station, 18 miles east. It will carry 6 passengers, 400 pounds of mail, a strongbox containing either gold dust or payroll depending on who you ask, and 1 driver. The driver is the most important cargo. Everything else is replaceable. His name is Charlie Parkhurst. He is 45 years old. He has been driving stages for 27 years, which makes him one of the most experienced reinsmen in California and Nevada territory. He is missing his left eye, lost it to a horse kick in the 1850s, and he chews tobacco like it is a personal vendetta. He stands about 5'7", weighs maybe 130 pounds, and he can handle a 6-horse hitch in a thunderstorm on a mountain road in the dark. There are men twice his size who will not get on the box with him because they are afraid of looking incompetent by comparison. Charlie walks out of the station house now, moving with the bow-legged roll of someone who has spent more time on a driver's seat than on the ground. He is wearing canvas trousers, a wool shirt, a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He nods to the station keeper. He does not say good morning because Charlie Parkhurst does not waste words. He inspects the hitch. He runs his hand down each horse's leg, checking for heat, for swelling, for anything that might mean trouble 15 miles from nowhere. Then he climbs onto the box, settles into the seat, and picks up the reins. 6 leather lines. Each one connects to a different horse's bit. In Charlie's hands, those lines are a musical instrument. He can tell you which horse is pulling left, which one is lagging, which one is about to spook, just from the vibration coming up through his fingers. It is not a skill you can teach. You either have the feel for it, or you do not. The passengers climb into the coach. They do not speak to Charlie. Passengers rarely speak to drivers. You are somewhere between a servant and a piece of equipment. You exist to get them from one place to another without dying. If you do that, they might tip you. If you do not, they will complain to the line superintendent, and you will be out of a job. Charlie does not care. He releases the brake. He makes a sound with his mouth that that is not quite a word. The horses lean into their collars. The coach lurches forward, and just like that, you are gone into the immense blue emptiness of the West, where the next human being might be 18 miles away, and the space in between belongs to no one. This is what stagecoach driving was. A job that required physical strength, absolute fearlessness, and the ability to survive alone for days at a time in country that wanted you dead. It paid well by frontier standards, around $50 to $100 a month depending on the route and the line. It commanded a certain rough respect. And it was one of the few occupations in the American West where no one cared very much about your past, your politics, or what you did in your private hours, as long as you could drive. Which made it, for some men, a kind of sanctuary. Let us talk about what a stagecoach driver actually did, because the popular image, a cheerful cowboy singing on the box seat, is comprehensively wrong. A driver worked alone. You were responsible for a coach, a hitch of 4 to 6 horses, several hundred pounds of mail, passengers who might include anyone from a schoolteacher to a wanted murderer, and occasionally a strongbox full of gold. Your job was to cover the route, which might be anywhere from 15 to 60 miles, and deliver everything intact to the next relay station. You did this in all weather. You did this on roads that were often just wheel ruts in the dirt. You did this through terrain where a broken axle could mean you and your passengers died of thirst before anyone found you. The historian W. Turrentine Jackson spent years in the archives of Wells Fargo and the California Stage Company, reading through driver logs and payroll records and incident reports. What he found was that stage drivers in the 1860s and 1870s had one of the highest casualty rates of any civilian occupation in American history. Hold-ups, runaways, crashes, drownings at river crossings, shootouts with road agents, attacks by displaced native groups defending their land, all routine hazards. Jackson counted over 400 documented deaths of stagecoach drivers in California and Nevada between 1849 and 1880. That is more than one a month for 30 years. And yet men lined up for the job. Because it paid. Because it came with a kind of status. You were the male, you were the connection, you were the man who could get through. And because for some men, the solitude and the danger and the sheer geographic distance from polite society made it one of the few places they could breathe. Charlie Parkhurst loved the work. The records are thin. Drivers did not leave diaries mostly. But we know Charlie drove for Wells Fargo, for the California Stage Company, and for several smaller lines over nearly 3 decades. We know Charlie had a reputation as one of the best reinsmen in the West. We know Charlie was taciturn, reliable, and ornery in the particular way of men who do not suffer fools. And we know that when Charlie Parkhurst died in 1879, the people who prepared the body for burial discovered something the historical record had not mentioned. Charlie Parkhurst was assigned female at birth. The newspapers lost their minds. The San Francisco Chronicle ran the story under the headline, "The Last of Charlie Parkhurst." The article is a mess of misgendering and sensationalism, but underneath the noise, a few facts emerge. Charlie was born in New Hampshire in 1812, assigned female, given a name the records do not preserve. Charlie ran away from an orphanage as a young teenager, disguised as a boy, and found work in a stable. Charlie learned to handle horses. Charlie moved west during the gold rush. Charlie lived as a man for 56 years. Was Charlie trans? Was Charlie a woman in disguise for economic survival? The language we have now did not exist then. Charlie never wrote a memoir. Charlie never explained. What we know is that Charlie lived entirely, consistently, publicly, as a man for over half a century, in an occupation that required physical proximity to other men, in bunkhouses and relay stations and on long overnight runs, and no one knew. Or perhaps some people knew and did not care. The frontier was a strange place for gender. It was violent and hierarchical and deeply normative in many ways, Marriage, family, land ownership all followed strict patriarchal lines. But it was also a place where the normal mechanisms of social surveillance broke down. You could not ask for a birth certificate at a relay station in the middle of Nevada. You could not demand someone produce a letter from their parish priest. If a man showed up, did the work, and did not make trouble, that was generally sufficient. And stagecoach driving in particular was a world of men who lived largely apart from women. Not because women were excluded by law, there were no legal barriers, but because the job was brutal, dangerous, and required a kind of life that did not easily accommodate marriage or domesticity. You were gone for days at a time. You slept in relay stations that were often just a bunk and a stove. You ate whatever the station keeper had boiled. You spent your waking hours on a wooden seat in all weather, holding the reins for hours until your shoulders seized and your hands cramped. It was not a life that attracted men looking to settle down, which meant it attracted a certain other kind of man. Let me introduce you to a second driver. His name is James Miller. He drove for the Butterfield Overland Mail in the 1850s, before the Civil War shut down the southern route. We know less about James Miller than we do about Charlie Parkhurst, but we know he was young, probably in his early 20s when he started driving. And we know he was literate because he left a handful of letters in the Butterfield Company archives, now held at the Huntington Library. One of those letters is to another driver, a man named Tom Shaw. The letter is dated 1858. It is written from a relay station in western Texas, and it is one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence we have about the emotional lives of stagecoach drivers in the years before the Civil War. Miller writes, "I think of you often, more often than is probably good for a man in my position. The road is long and the stations are cold, and I find myself wishing for the nights we spent at the Tucson house, when the wind was up and we had only each other for warmth. I do not know if I will see you again. The company is moving me north. But I want you to know I have never in my life felt less alone than I did in your company." It is signed, "Yours, J. Miller." The letter survived because it was never sent. It was found in Miller's effects after he was killed in a stagecoach accident outside of El Paso in 1859. Tom Shaw may never have known Miller felt that way, or perhaps he did, and they had other nights in other stations, and none of it made it into the archive. What the letter tells us is that intimacy happened, that men who lived this life found each other, that the long stretches of solitude and the close quarters of the relay stations and the shared danger created a kind of bond that sometimes crossed over into love. And it tells us that Miller knew it was dangerous to say so. More often than is probably good for a man in my position. He knew the risk. He wrote the letter anyway. Then he did not send it. Frontier masculinity had very specific rules. A man was supposed to be strong, silent, self-reliant, and restrained. He worked hard. He did not complain. He did not show weakness. He did not talk about feelings. The ideal frontier man, in the mythology of the period, was a stoic loner who needed nothing and no one. In practice, frontier men were desperately lonely. The gender ratio in many western mining towns and railroad camps in the 1850s and 1860s was 10 men for every woman, sometimes worse. Men lived in bunkhouses, in tents, in camps where the only human contact was other men. They worked together. They slept in the same rooms. They bathed in the same rivers. They spent months at a time in all-male environments where the only intimacy available was with each other. And some of them took it. The historian Peter Boag spent over a decade researching same-sex intimacy in the 19th century American West. What he found, documented in newspapers, court records, and private letters, was a consistent pattern of relationships between men that the language of the time called bachelor partnerships or particular friendships. Two men would share a cabin, share expenses, share a bed. They would be known locally as a pair. When one died, the other would inherit. Sometimes they were biological brothers, sometimes they were business partners, and sometimes, reading between the lines, they were clearly something else. Boag writes, "The frontier offered a temporary suspension of the surveillance mechanisms that governed sexuality in more settled parts of the country. It was not that the West was a paradise of tolerance. far from it. But it was a place where two men could live together without immediate suspicion, as long as they contributed to the economic and social life of the community. The boundary was not the relationship. The boundary was visibility, which means that if you were careful, if you were useful, if you kept your private life private, you could have a life that would have been impossible in Boston or Philadelphia. Charlie Parkhurst never married. Charlie lived alone, mostly, in a small cabin near Watsonville, California, after retiring from driving in the 1870s. But the neighbors remembered that Charlie had a friend, another former driver, who visited often and sometimes stayed for weeks. The neighbors thought nothing of it. Two old drivers, keeping each other company. When Charlie died, the friend was the one who found the body. We do not have the friend's name. The newspapers did not think it was important. But someone was there. Someone knew Charlie well enough to visit regularly, to stay overnight, to be the first person Charlie's neighbors thought to notify when something seemed wrong. Someone who may or may not have known about Charlie's body and who kept that secret regardless. The archive is full of ghosts like this, relationships that left just enough trace to prove they happened, but not enough to reconstruct. A letter never sent, a visitor with no name, a pair of men who shared a cabin and a bank account and are listed in the census as partners, which could mean business, or could mean something else, or could mean both. Let me take you inside a relay station at night so you understand the physical reality of this world. A relay station in Nevada Territory in 1867 is a rough structure. One large room, sometimes divided by a curtain or a half wall, a stone fireplace at one end, a cook stove, a table, benches, and along the walls, bunks, wooden frames with rope webbing and a thin mattress stuffed with straw or corn husks. No sheets. You sleep in your clothes. Sometimes there are enough bunks for every man to have his own. Often there are not. The station keeper lives here full time. His job is to maintain the horses, feed the drivers and passengers, and keep the place marginally functional. He is paid $30 to $40 a month and receives supplies every 2 weeks if the weather holds. He is alone most of the time. When a stage comes through, he has company for 20 minutes while the horses are changed. Then he is alone again. Drivers, on the other hand, are constantly moving. You drive your route, say, from Station A to Station C, and then you sleep at Station C while another driver takes the coach onward to Station E. The next day, you drive the return route, back to Station A. If the schedule is running on time, you sleep at a different station every night. If the schedule is disrupted, weather, breakdowns, hold-ups, you might be stuck at a single station for days, which means drivers got to know each other in a specific way. You would see the same men on the same routes, week after week. You would pass each other on the road, heading opposite directions. You would overlap at certain stations where the schedules aligned. You would share a bunk, share a meal, share the silence of men too tired to talk. And in that silence, things happened that no one wrote down. The historian William Bauer Jr., working with Paiute and Shoshone oral histories, found accounts of relay stations where the native people who worked as stock handlers and laborers observed that certain drivers always requested the same sleeping arrangements, always the same bunk partner, always a specific configuration. Bauer notes, the indigenous employees understood what was happening. They had their own frameworks for understanding same-sex intimacy, frameworks that were more expansive than the binary categories of the settler society. What struck them as notable was not the intimacy itself, but the fact that the white men seemed to think they were hiding it. Because here is the thing about frontier secrecy. It was not necessarily about invisibility. It was about deniability. As long as no one said the thing out loud, as long as the relationship could theoretically be explained as brotherhood or partnership or friendship, it was allowed to exist. The line you could not cross was explicitness. You could share a bunk. You could not talk about why. You could live together for 20 years. You could not call it marriage. You could leave everything you owned to your partner when you died. You could not write lover in the will. Stay inside the understood performance, and you were fine. Step outside it, and you were in danger. James Miller's unsent letter tells you everything about that danger. He wanted to say it. He needed to say it, and he knew that putting it in writing, sending it through the actual US mail that he himself was carrying, was too great a risk. So he wrote it and kept it and died with it in his pocket. There is a particular loneliness in that. The loneliness of knowing you are not alone, knowing someone else feels the same pull, the same need, and still not being able to speak it. Tonight, we name it. We say, James Miller loved Tom Shaw. We say it clearly, because he could not. Let me tell you about the Concorde coach itself, because the vehicle shaped the work, and the work shaped the men. A Concorde stagecoach, built by Abbott Downing Company in Concord, New Hampshire, was the finest passenger vehicle in the world in the 1860s. It weighed 2,500 pounds empty. It could carry 9 passengers inside, plus luggage, mail, and cargo lashed to the roof. The body was suspended on leather thoroughbraces, thick straps that allowed the coach to rock and sway rather than jolt, which meant passengers arrived bruised and nauseated instead of dead. The driver sat on an exposed bench called the box, 10 feet off the ground. No roof, no windshield, no protection. You were up there in the sun, the rain, the snow, the dust. You held the reins for 4 to 8 hours at a stretch. Your hands blistered, then calloused, then scarred. Your face weathered until you looked 20 years older than you were. You developed a permanent squint from staring into the distance, looking for the road, looking for trouble. It was punishing work, and it required a very specific skill set. First, you had to be strong enough to handle the reins. 6 leather lines, each one pulling against a horse's mouth, adds up to hundreds of pounds of tension. You held that tension with your forearms, your wrists, your core, for hours. If you lost your grip, the horses ran. If the horses ran on a mountain road, everyone died. Second, you had to be able to read the road. Frontier roads were not marked. They were wheel ruts, sometimes a foot deep, carved into dirt or sand or rock. In the rain, they turned to mud that could swallow a wheel. In the desert, they disappeared under wind-blown sand. You had to know the route by memory, every turn, every grade, every place where the road narrowed or washed out. A wrong turn could add 20 miles. In some places, that meant the difference between reaching water and not. Third, you had to be able to handle a crisis. Horses spooked, axles broke, harnesses snapped, passengers panicked, and sometimes men with guns stepped into the road and told you to stop. Charlie Parkhurst was held up once, in the 1850s, on the road between Mariposa and Stockton. 2 men with shotguns. They told Charlie to throw down the strongbox. Charlie reached under the seat, where drivers kept a weapon, sometimes a pistol, sometimes a rifle, sometimes a sawed-off shotgun. Charlie shot one of the robbers in the stomach. The other one ran. Charlie delivered the strongbox, the mail, and the passengers on time. The California Stage Company gave Charlie a bonus. The passengers took up a collection. Charlie bought a better gun. Was Charlie afraid? Probably. Fear is a reasonable response to being robbed at gunpoint. But Charlie did the job anyway, because that was the job. You drove the route. You protected the cargo. You did not quit. That combination of danger and competence created a specific kind of status. A good driver was respected, not liked necessarily. Drivers had a reputation for being surly and antisocial, but respected. You were the person who got people through. In a world where survival often depended on someone else's skill, that mattered. And it meant that drivers had leverage. If you were good, the company needed you more than you needed the company. You could negotiate your pay. You could choose your routes. You could, within limits, set your own terms, which gave drivers a small measure of control over their lives that most working men in the 19th century did not have. Charlie used that leverage to stay single, stay employed, and stay mobile. For 56 years, until the body gave it away. There were other drivers whose stories intersect with Charlie's. Men whose names appear in the same payroll ledgers, the same station logs. One of them was George Monroe, called Pop by the other drivers because he was older. He started driving in his 40s, which was unusual. Pop Monroe drove the route between Virginia City and Carson City in the 1860s. He was known for singing on the box, which most drivers did not do. He had a good voice. Passengers remembered it. Pop Monroe never married either. He lived in a boarding house in Carson City during the off-season. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Ackerman, and she later told a newspaper that Pop Monroe received letters from a man in San Francisco. Letters that came every few months, and that Pop would read alone in his room and then burn in the stove. Mrs. Ackerman thought it was strange. She mentioned it because, after Pop Monroe died in 1871, kicked by a horse, a mundane death for a stagecoach driver, she found a photograph in his room. Two men, standing close together, unsmiling in the way of early photographs. One of them was Pop Monroe. The other was unidentified. Mrs. Ackerman gave the photograph to Pop's nephew, who was his only living relative. The nephew threw it away. He told Mrs. Ackerman he did not know who the other man was and did not care. But someone sent those letters. Someone wrote to Pop Monroe every few months for years. Someone stood next to him for a photograph, which in the 1860s required going to a studio, posing together, paying for the image. Someone mattered enough to keep. And then the nephew threw it away, because he did not want to know. The archive is full of erasures like this. Photographs thrown away. Letters burned. Relationships that existed in documented fact. Two men sharing a cabin lease. Sharing a bank account, named in wills as sole beneficiaries. And then carefully, systematically unnamed by family members who inherited the evidence and decided it was shameful. What survives is often accidental. A letter that was never sent and therefore never burned. A census record where the enumerator wrote down exactly what he saw. Two men, no women, listed as heads of household together. A gravestone where someone paid extra to have two names carved side by side. And the stonecutter did not ask questions. We are looking for ghosts by the shadows they cast. Let me tell you what the work actually felt like, hour by hour, because the physicality matters. You wake up at a relay station before dawn. If you are lucky, the station keeper has boiled coffee. If you are not, you boil it yourself. The coffee is mostly burnt grain and chicory. It tastes like regret. You drink it anyway because you need the heat and the bitterness to shock you awake. You walk out to the corral. The horses are already nervous because they know what comes next. You halter them one by one, lead them to the hitching area, brush them down quickly. Not for aesthetics, for function. You are checking for galls, for cuts, for swelling. A horse with a saddle sore will fight the harness. A horse with a stone bruise will go lame 10 miles out. You are looking for problems before they kill you. Then you harness them. This is a language of leather and metal. The collar goes over the head, upside down, then flipped. The hames slide into the collar groove. The traces clip to the singletree. The reins thread through the rings on the hames and back to your hands. You do this in the dark, mostly by feel, because the coach leaves at first light, whether you are ready or not. 6 horses. 3 pairs. The wheelers nearest the coach. They are the strongest, the steadiest, because they bear the weight when the coach brakes or backs up. The swing team in the middle. They keep the line straight. They prevent the leaders from cutting corners too sharp. And the leaders up front, they are the smartest, the most responsive, because they take their cues from you and set the direction for everyone behind them. You are orchestrating 12,000 pounds of animal mass and another 3,000 pounds of wood and iron and human bodies. The margin for error is 0. You climb onto the box. The reins are already in your hands. You do not think about which line connects to which horse anymore. Your hands know. You release the brake, a long wooden lever that presses iron shoes against the rear wheels. You make a sound in your throat, something between a click and a whistle. The horses lean forward. The coach rolls. For the first mile, everyone is tense. The horses are fresh and want to run. The passengers are awake and therefore complaining. You hold the horses to a trot, not because you are kind, but because a galloping coach on a rutted road will shake itself to pieces. You let them settle. You let the rhythm establish itself. Walk, trot, walk, trot. The coach rocks on its thoroughbraces. The wheels find the ruts. You stop fighting it and start guiding it. By the second mile, it is almost meditative. The reins hum in your hands. You can feel every shift in the horse's mood through the leather, a tightening when something spooks them, a slackening when they relax. You are not driving them so much as negotiating with them. You ask, they answer, you adjust. The landscape rolls past. Sagebrush, juniper, distant mountains that never seem to get closer. The sky is enormous. You are a small thing moving through a large emptiness. Hours pass. The sun climbs. The heat builds. You sweat through your shirt. You do not stop. At the swing station, the midpoint stop where the horses are changed, but the passengers do not disembark. You have 10 minutes. You climb down. Your legs do not quite work. You have been sitting in the same position for 4 hours, and your knees have opinions about it. You drink water. You eat whatever the station keeper hands you. Bread, jerky, something that might be bacon. You do not taste it. You use the privy. You climb back onto the box. Fresh horses. You do not know these animals. They do not know you. You have to establish dominance in the first 30 seconds, or they will test you for the next 4 hours. You gather the reins. You do not let them feel any slack, any uncertainty. You are the authority. You are the thing they listen to. You prove it by driving them exactly as hard as they can handle, and no harder. Another 4 hours. The sun is overhead now, pressing down like a hand. There is no shade on the box. Your hat helps, not enough. You squint into the brightness until your eyes ache. You watch the road. You watch the horse's ears. They will hear trouble before you see it. You listen to the coach. A new sound, a creak, a rattle, might mean something is failing. You drive. By the time you reach the home station, you have been on the box for 8 to 10 hours. You are dehydrated, exhausted, and so stiff you have to be helped down by the station keeper. You eat. You sleep. The next morning, you do it again. Some men lasted 6 months before they quit. Some lasted a year. Charlie Parkhurst did it for 27 years. Think about that. 27 years of 10-hour days on an exposed bench, holding the reins, reading the road, managing animals that outweighed you by 1,000 pounds each. 27 years of desert heat and mountain cold and storms that came out of nowhere and turned the road into a river. 27 years of knowing that a moment of inattention could kill you and everyone you were responsible for. You do not do that unless you need it. Unless the work is giving you something you cannot get anywhere else. For Charlie, it was probably freedom. The freedom to live as a man without constant scrutiny. The freedom to be competent, respected, left alone. The freedom to define yourself by what you could do, rather than what you were born as. For other drivers, the freedom was different. It was the freedom to live at a distance from wives, from families, from the entire structure of domestic expectation. The freedom to exist in a world of men where certain kinds of closeness were possible because they were never named. Let me take you to another driver. His name is William Cody, not Buffalo Bill, different Cody, less famous. William Cody drove for the Overland Mail in the early 1860s, before he enlisted in the Union Army and disappeared from the historical record. We know about him because of a court case. In 1863, in Salt Lake City, a man named Daniel Stokes filed a property claim against the estate of a deceased driver named Robert Talmadge. Stokes claimed that he and Talmadge had been business partners and that Talmadge's cabin, his horses, and his savings should pass to Stokes rather than to Talmadge's sister in Ohio, who had not seen her brother in 15 years. The sister challenged the claim. The case went to a territorial judge, and in the course of the trial, several witnesses testified about the relationship between Stokes and Talmadge. One of those witnesses was William Cody. He testified that Stokes and Talmadge had lived together for 7 years, that they shared a cabin near the overland mail route, that Talmadge had explicitly told Cody, in the presence of other drivers, that if anything happened to him, everything he owned should go to Stokes. The judge asked Cody what the nature of the relationship was. Cody said they were partners. The judge asked if they were business partners. Cody said he did not know about their business arrangements, only that they lived together and that Talmadge considered Stokes his closest companion. The judge awarded the estate to Stokes. The sister appealed. The appeal was denied. The ruling stood. What is fascinating about this case is not just that it happened, though that alone is significant, but that Cody's testimony was accepted as sufficient. The judge did not demand a written contract. He did not demand proof of financial partnership. He took the word of another driver, a man who knew both parties, who had observed the relationship and understood what it meant. And the legal system in Utah Territory in 1863 said, "Fine, that counts. It would not count 20 years later." By the 1880s, the legal and medical establishment had begun to codify homosexuality as a category, as a disease, as a crime distinct from the act of sodomy. By the 1880s, 2 men living together without women would be suspect in a way they were not in the 1860s. But in 1863, in the legal wilderness of the territories, before the language had hardened, a judge looked at the evidence and recognized a relationship that mattered. He did not call it marriage. He did not call it anything. He just ruled that it was real. Stokes kept the cabin. We do not know what happened to him after that. The record stops, but for 7 years, he and Robert Talmadge had a home. They built something that survived Talmadge's death, and a legal challenge, and the objections of blood family. That is more than most people got. The relay stations were where these relationships became visible, because the stations were the only fixed points in a world of constant motion. A swing station was minimal, a barn, a corral, sometimes a shed where the stock handler slept. The home stations, where drivers rested overnight, were slightly more developed. A bunkhouse, a dining room, a separate cabin for the station keeper if he had a family, which most did not. Station keepers were a specific type. You had to be willing to live alone for weeks at a time, in a place where the nearest neighbor might be 15 miles away and the nearest town might be 3 days' ride. You had to be able to handle stock, handle men, handle trouble, and you had to be resilient in the face of profound isolation. Some station keepers were former drivers who had aged out of the work. Some were men with unclear pasts who needed to be far from the law. Some were immigrants, Irish, Chinese, Mexican, who were excluded from other forms of labor and took what they could get. And some were men who needed to be far from the world for reasons they did not explain. There is a station keeper named Samuel Oakes who shows up in the Overland Mail records in 1866. He ran a home station in eastern Nevada on the route between Austin and Ely. The company logs describe him as reliable, solitary, and good with horses. He worked for the Overland for 4 years. Then in 1870, he vanished, just stopped showing up. The company sent a supervisor to check on the station. The station was clean, the horses were fed, and Oakes was gone. He left a note that said he had business elsewhere and would not be returning. The supervisor found letters in Oakes's cabin. They were from a man in Philadelphia. The letters were affectionate, discussing shared memories, expressing longing, making plans for a future reunion that apparently never happened. The supervisor read enough to understand what they were. He burned them. He noted in his report to the company that Oakes had absconded for personal reasons and recommended they not pursue the matter, which tells you the supervisor knew and tells you he considered it less trouble to let Oakes disappear than to make the reasons public. Oakes may have gone back to Philadelphia, or he may have gone somewhere else, somewhere even more remote, somewhere he could vanish entirely. We do not know. The record ends with the burned letters and the empty station. But the letters existed. Someone in Philadelphia wrote to Samuel Oakes for years. Someone knew where he was and stayed in contact across a continent. Someone cared enough to keep writing, even though Oakes was living in the kind of isolation that most people could not endure. And then a company supervisor burned the evidence because it was easier than explaining. Let us talk about the physical closeness of this world, because it is central to understanding how intimacy was possible. Relay stations were small. The bunkhouse might have space for 4 to 6 men. The bunks were stacked, sometimes too high. The mattresses were thin. The blankets were wool, rough, and never quite warm enough. In winter, the temperature inside the bunkhouse at night might drop below freezing. The stove was in the main room. The bunks were not, so men slept close. 2 to a bunk was common, especially in winter. It was practical. Body heat kept you from freezing. No one thought anything of it, except that proximity creates opportunity, and opportunity, over time, creates intimacy. If you shared a bunk with the same man every time your routes overlapped, week after week, month after month, you learned things. You learned how he slept, on his back, on his side, curled tight or sprawled loose. You learned his rhythms, how long it took him to fall asleep, whether he snored, whether he woke in the night. You learned his smell, his warmth, the particular geometry of fitting 2 bodies into a space meant for one. And if you were lonely, and if he was lonely, and if you were both careful, things could happen in that narrow space that would be impossible to prove afterward. There are no confessions. No one wrote it down, but the structure of the life made it possible. The isolation made it necessary, and the culture of silence made it survivable. The historian John D'Amelio, working on the emergence of gay identity in the United States, argued that same-sex intimacy in the 19th century was enabled by specific economic and spatial conditions. Men who worked in all-male environments, sailors, soldiers, miners, railroad workers, cowboys, and yes, stagecoach drivers, had access to forms of intimacy that were functionally unavailable to men in settled domestic contexts. D'Amelio writes, "The frontier West was not a gay paradise. It was a hard, dangerous, often violent place. But it was a place where the mechanisms of surveillance that governed sexuality in the East were temporarily absent. And in that absence, people found each other. They found each other in bunkhouses, in remote cabins, in relay stations where the next human being was 18 miles away and the mail came once a week. They found each other, and they built something temporary and fragile and real. And then they moved on, because the work demanded it, or they stayed, because they had found the one place they could breathe, or they vanished, because someone noticed and it was no longer safe. Charlie Parkhurst stayed. For 56 years, Charlie stayed. In the 1870s, when the railroads began to replace the stagecoach lines, Charlie retired, bought a small piece of land near Watsonville, California, built a cabin, raised chickens, lived quietly. The neighbors described Charlie as a recluse, but not unfriendly. Charlie would come into town for supplies, exchange a few words, and leave. Charlie voted in the 1868 presidential election, probably the first person assigned female at birth to vote legally in California, though no one knew it at the time. And Charlie had a visitor. The neighbors remembered him. An older man, also a former driver. He came to Charlie's cabin every few months and stayed for a week or 2. The neighbors assumed he was a friend from the old days. No one thought it was strange. Old drivers visiting each other, swapping stories, keeping the boredom at bay. When Charlie died in 1879 of cancer, the visitor was not there. The neighbors found Charlie's body after several days. They prepared it for burial. And that is when they discovered the truth. The newspapers had a field day. Charlie Parkhurst, famous whip, dies, was a woman. The articles are cruel, sensationalist, obsessed with the deception. They misgender Charlie throughout. They speculate about Charlie's motives. Was it for money, for freedom, for love? They treat Charlie's life as a curiosity, a sideshow, a story to sell papers. But underneath the noise, a few details emerge. Charlie left a will. Everything went to a man named Frank Woodward. Frank Woodward was the visitor. The will described him as Charlie's particular friend and companion. Frank Woodward collected the inheritance, a small amount of money, the cabin, some personal effects. Then he disappeared from the record. We do not know if Frank knew about Charlie's body. We do not know if it mattered to him. We do not know if they were lovers or friends, or something the English language in 1879 did not have a word for. What we know is that Charlie trusted him, enough to leave him everything, enough to name him in a legal document as the person who mattered most. And Frank Woodward honored that trust by taking what Charlie left him and vanishing before the newspapers could make him part of the spectacle. There is a deep dignity in that silence. The Stagecoach era lasted roughly 30 years in the American West. It began in earnest after the California gold rush in 1849, when the sudden flood of people into the West created a need for reliable mail and passenger service. It peaked in the 1860s, when companies like Wells Fargo, the Overland Mail, and the California Stage Company operated thousands of miles of routes across the most inhospitable terrain on the continent. And it ended in the 1870s and 1880s when the Transcontinental Railroad made stagecoaches obsolete. You could ship mail and passengers across the country in a week by train, compared to a month by stage. The economics were irrefutable. The stage lines contracted, consolidated, and finally shut down. The men who had driven the stages found other work, or did not. Some became teamsters, driving freight wagons. Some became ranchers. Some became nothing. Too old, too broken, too specialized in a skill that no longer had value. Charlie Parkhurst was one of the lucky ones. Charlie had saved money, had bought land, had a friend. Charlie got to retire, but many drivers did not. They ended up in poor houses, in charity hospitals, in unmarked graves. The work destroyed their bodies, and when the work disappeared, there was nothing left. The historian Oscar Winther, who wrote one of the foundational studies of Western stagecoach lines, interviewed elderly former drivers in the 1920s and 1930s. By then they were in their 80s and 90s, the last men who remembered the routes, the stations, the feel of the reins. Winther asked them what they missed about the work. They did not miss the danger. They did not miss the discomfort. They did not miss the low pay or the bad food or the isolation. What they missed, almost universally, was the freedom. One of them, a man named Albert Henderson, who had driven for Wells Fargo in the 1860s, told Winther, "You were alone up there on the box, just you and the horses and the road, nobody telling you how to live, nobody asking questions. You did the job, and the rest of your life was yours." Winther asked him if he had been lonely. Henderson said, "Sometimes, but I knew men who were lonelier in crowded houses. That is the paradox of the frontier. It was isolating, yes, but isolation can also be freedom. If the price of privacy is loneliness, some men were willing to pay it, and some men found that they were not alone after all." Let me tell you about one more driver. His name was Nathan Turner. He drove for the California Stage Company in the 1850s before the Civil War. He was known as a good driver, steady and reliable. In 1857, he was on a run from Sacramento to Placerville when the coach went off the road on a steep grade. The coach rolled. Nathan was thrown from the box. He broke his back. He survived, but he could not drive anymore. The company paid him a small settlement, $50, which was nothing. He used it to rent a room in a boarding house in Sacramento. He could not work. He had no family. He was 26 years old and his life was functionally over, except that another driver, a man named Peter Harrigan, heard about the accident. Peter had driven the same route. He and Nathan had overlapped at stations, shared meals, shared bunks. Peter took a leave from the company, went to Sacramento, and moved into the boarding house. The boarding house ledger, which survives in the California State Archives, lists them as sharing a room. For 3 months, Peter stayed. He paid Nathan's rent. He brought food. He helped Nathan with the things Nathan could no longer do alone: bathing, dressing, getting to the privy. Then Nathan died. The injury had damaged something internal that the doctors could not fix. He died in the boarding house, in the room he shared with Peter. Peter paid for the burial. He had Nathan's name carved on a wooden marker. Then he went back to driving. The boarding house keeper, a woman named Mrs. Callahan, later told a local historian that Peter had wept at the funeral. She said she had never seen a man cry like that, openly, without shame, as if something essential had been torn out of him. She assumed they were brothers. She wrote brothers in her diary when she described the funeral. They were not brothers. Nathan had no siblings. Peter had family in Illinois, none of whom came to the funeral. They were something else, something the language of the time could not name, or would not. But Peter stayed for 3 months, and paid the rent, and wept at the grave. That is love. Call it what you want. The graves are still there, some of them, scattered across the West in small cemeteries that no one visits anymore. Wooden markers rotted away decades ago. The names are gone, but the graves remain. Anonymous divots in the earth where men who drove stagecoaches were buried by the people who knew them, or by strangers who found them, or by no one at all. In the Virginia City Cemetery in Nevada, there's a section called the Driver's Plot. 17 graves, marked and unmarked. The marked ones have names and dates. Died 1863, died 1867, died 1871. The unmarked ones are just stones, or iron crosses, or nothing, just depressions in the ground where the earth settled after the coffin rotted. The local historical society did a survey in the 1950s, trying to match the graves to names in the stage company records. They managed to identify 9 of the 17. The other 8 are unknown. Men who died far from wherever they were born, who had no family to claim them, who were buried by fellow drivers or station keepers or the county, and then forgotten. One of those graves has 2 iron crosses, side by side. Same size, same style, no names. The Historical Society noted it in their survey report. 2 crosses, placement suggests simultaneous burial or intentional pairing. No records found. 2 men, buried together. Maybe they died in the same accident. Maybe they died years apart and someone made sure they ended up next to each other. Maybe they asked for it and someone honoured the request. We will never know. But someone put those crosses there. Someone thought it mattered that they were together. Let us go back to the work, because the work is where the culture lived. Stage driving had an informal hierarchy. At the bottom were the rookies, men in their first year, still learning the routes, still proving they could handle the job. They got the worst runs, the least reliable horses, the lowest pay. They were hazed mercilessly by the experienced drivers, because frontier masculinity required that you earn respect through suffering. In the middle were the steady men. Drivers with 3 to 10 years of experience who knew their routes, had their regular horses, and could be counted on to deliver on time in reasonable weather. They were the backbone of the system. They were not famous, they were essential. And at the top were the reinsmen, the drivers so skilled they became legends. Charlie Parkhurst was one. Hank Monk, who drove the Placerville route and once drove Horace Greeley so fast that Greeley begged him to slow down, was another. John Whistler, who could drive a 6-horse hitch in the dark through a snowstorm and never miss a turn. These men were celebrities in their small world. Passengers requested them by name. Other drivers studied them, trying to learn what made them different. What made them different was usually one thing. They were not afraid. Or rather, they were afraid. Everyone was afraid. But they did not let the fear stop them. They drove into storms. They drove at night. They drove on roads where one wrong move meant a 100-foot drop. And they did it with a kind of casual competence that looked like courage but was actually something harder. It was the ability to function inside terror. Hank Monk once said, this is recorded in a newspaper interview from 1870, that the secret to driving was to never think about what could go wrong. You thought about the road in front of you, the next 100 yards, the next turn. You stayed in the present, because if you started thinking about all the ways you could die, you would freeze. And freezing killed you faster than anything else. Charlie Parkhurst seems to have operated on the same principle. The stories about Charlie, and there are many, some certainly exaggerated, all emphasize the same quality. Charlie did not panic. Stage on fire. Charlie put it out. Horse broke a leg. Charlie shot it, re-hitched the team, and kept driving. Flood washed out the bridge. Charlie found a ford. That steadiness, that unshakable pragmatism, was what made Charlie valuable. And it was also what allowed Charlie to live as a man for 56 years without being discovered. Because panic makes you visible. Panic makes people look at you closely. If you stay calm, stay competent, stay useful, people do not interrogate you. They just let you work. It is a survival strategy, and it worked until Charlie's body gave the secret away. But there were other drivers whose survival strategy was different, who survived not by being unshakable, but by being invisible in a different way, by blending into the background, by being unremarkable, by never drawing attention. There is a driver named Joseph Sims who appears in the Butterfield Overland Mail records in the late 1850s. The records describe him as quiet, competent, and unremarkable. He drove the route between Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Fort Chadbourne, Texas. He worked for Butterfield for 2 years. Then he quit. No explanation in the company records. He just stopped showing up. A decade later, in 1868, a man named Joseph Sims appears in the San Francisco City Directory as a clerk in a dry goods store. The directory lists him as living at the same address as another man, a ship's carpenter named Thomas Brennan. They are listed as co-heads of household. Is it the same Joseph Sims? Maybe. The dates work. The age works. He would have been in his early 20s when he drove for Butterfield, in his 30s when he appeared in San Francisco. And Joseph Sims is not an uncommon name, but the specific combination of a former stagecoach driver ending up in San Francisco, living with another man in the late 1860s, is suggestive. If it is the same Joseph Sims, then his story is a quiet one. He drove stages for 2 years. He quit. He went to San Francisco, which by the 1860s was already known as a city where men could live differently. He found work. He found someone to live with. He disappeared into the anonymity of the city. No drama, no scandal. Just a man who did a dangerous job for a while and then found a safer way to live. The thing about the frontier is that it was temporary. The stage lines, the relay stations, the rough democracy of men living and working together far from the oversight of settled society. It all lasted maybe 30 years, 1 generation, and then the railroads came, and then the towns grew, and then the mechanisms of surveillance and control that governed life in the East extended themselves westward, and the space where certain kinds of freedom had been possible began to close. By the 1880s, the medical establishment had begun to classify same-sex desire as a pathology. By the 1890s, urban police forces were conducting raids on known gathering places for men who desired other men. By the early 1900s, the legal codes had hardened, and what had once been ambiguous, 2 men living together, sharing a life, was now suspect. The frontier had closed, not just geographically, but culturally. The men who had lived through the stage era, who had known a different kind of freedom, found themselves in a world that had less room for them. Some adapted, some hid, some did not survive. Charlie Parkhurst died in 1879, right at the edge of that shift. Charlie never had to navigate the new world where the categories were harder, the scrutiny more intense, the consequences more severe. Charlie got to live the whole life as a man and die before the world decided that was impossible. But the younger drivers, the men who were in their 20s and 30s when the stage era ended, had to live through the transition. And we do not know how most of them managed it. because they did not leave records. They just disappeared into the anonymous mass of working men, and whatever they had been on the frontier stayed there, except for the ones who could not disappear, the ones who were visible, or unlucky, or too stubborn to hide. Let me tell you about a man named Edward Cowan. He drove for Wells Fargo in the 1870s, in the last years of the stage era. He was young, early 20s, and by all accounts a good driver. In 1876, he was arrested in Sacramento on a charge of sodomy. The details of the arrest are sparse. The Sacramento Daily Union reported it in a single paragraph. Edward Cowan, a stage driver, was taken into custody on charges of gross indecency. He will appear before the magistrate on Tuesday. There is no follow-up article. No trial record survives in the Sacramento archives. We do not know what happened to Edward Cowan after the arrest. He disappears from the Wells Fargo payroll. He does not appear in any subsequent city directories. He is just gone. But the arrest tells us something. It tells us that by the mid-1870s, even in the West, even in the rough-and-tumble world of stage drivers, the law was beginning to pay attention. The informal tolerance, the willingness to look the other way, was eroding. And it tells us that Edward Cowan was not careful enough, or was not lucky enough, or could not hide what he was. We do not know if Edward Cowan went to prison. We do not know if he fled. We do not know if he changed his name and started over somewhere else. The record is silent, but somewhere, a young man who drove stagecoaches had his life destroyed because he loved the wrong person, and the world moved on and forgot him. Let us talk about the stations again because I want you to understand how small the world was. A relay station in the 1860s served a section of road, usually 15 to 20 miles. That was the distance a team of horses could cover at a working pace before they needed to be swapped out. So the stations were spaced at intervals, like beads on a string, and the coaches moved from one to the next in a continuous relay. Each station had a keeper. Each keeper knew the drivers who worked his section of the route. Maybe 6 to 10 men, depending on how many coaches ran each day. You saw the same faces, week after week. You learned their habits. You knew who drank too much, who gambled, who sent money home to family, who never mentioned family at all. And the drivers knew each other. You passed each other on the road, one heading east, one heading west. You overlapped at the home stations. You heard news from other drivers about men who worked different routes. The world of stage drivers was small, maybe a few hundred men total across all the western lines. You could know a significant fraction of them personally just by working for a few years, which means that relationships, when they formed, were visible to a specific small community. Not to the wider world. Passengers did not care, company management did not care, but to the other drivers, to the station keepers, to the stock handlers and clerks and supervisors who made the system work. And that community, by and large, kept its secrets. There is a fascinating document in the Wells Fargo archives, a letter from a district supervisor named Charles McLaughlin to the San Francisco headquarters, dated 1871. McLaughlin is reporting on staffing for the eastern Nevada routes. He mentions several drivers by name, noting their performance, their reliability, their problems. And then he writes this: "There are 2 men on the Austin run, Thompson and Reed, who share a cabin near the Jacobsville station. They are both excellent drivers, and I recommend their continued employment. There has been some talk among the station keepers, but I have observed no impact on their work and see no reason to intervene." Some talk among the station keepers. McLaughlin knew, the station keepers knew, and McLaughlin's position was, it does not affect their work, so it is none of my business. That is not tolerance exactly, it is pragmatism. The company needed good drivers. Thompson and Reed were good drivers. Whatever they were doing in their cabin near Jacobsville, it was not McLaughlin's problem, unless it became the company's problem, and it never did. Thompson and Reed both appear in the Wells Fargo payroll records for another 3 years, until the railroad reached Austin and the stage route was discontinued. Then they disappear from the record. Did they stay together after the work ended? Did they go to different cities, different lives? We do not know. But for at least 3 years they had a cabin, they had each other, and they had a supervisor who decided that their private life was not worth destroying their livelihood over. That small mercy in the context of the 19th century, is astonishing. Let me tell you what it felt like to be a passenger on a stagecoach, because the passengers saw the drivers in a way that other drivers did not. You are sitting inside a Concord coach. There are 3 bench seats, one facing forward, one facing backward, one in the middle that folds down. Each seat is supposed to hold 3 people. In practice, you are crammed in with 8 other passengers, your knees touching the knees of the person across from you, your shoulder jammed against the person next to you. The air inside the coach is stale and hot. Someone has been sick. Someone else has not bathed in a week. You are breathing through your mouth. The coach rocks on its thoroughbraces. Not a gentle sway, a violent, lurching motion that makes your stomach flip every time the wheels hit a rut. You brace your feet against the floor. You hold onto the leather strap bolted to the ceiling. It does not help. You are being shaken like dice in a cup. Outside, above you, on the box, is the driver. You cannot see him from inside the coach. You can only hear him, the crack of the whip, the low, steady stream of words he directs at the horses, the creak of the brake lever when you start down a hill. You have been traveling for 6 hours. You will travel for another 4 before you reach the next home station where you can get out, stretch your legs, eat something, sleep. Assuming you reach the home station. Assuming the axle does not break. Assuming the horses do not bolt. Assuming you do not meet road agents with guns. Your life is in the hands of the man on the box. A man you have never met. A man you know nothing about except that the company trusted him to drive. And the thing is, you do trust him. You have no choice. But also, there is something reassuring about the steadiness of the motion. The way the driver corrects before you even feel the coach start to drift. The way he brings you down a steep grade so smoothly that you barely notice the descent until you are at the bottom. He is good at this. He knows what he is doing. That is enough. You do not think about his life. You do not wonder where he sleeps, who he loves, what he wants. He is a function, not a person. But he is a person. And somewhere, in a relay station, or a rented room, or a cabin near the route, he has a life that you will never see. One of the passengers who rode Charlie Parkhurst's stage in the 1860s, a man named J.D. Stevenson, who later wrote a memoir about his time in the Nevada silver mines, described Charlie this way: surly, competent, and entirely uninterested in conversation. He drove like a man who had been doing it forever and expected to do it forever. I felt safer with him on the box than I did in my own bed. Stevenson had no idea. None of the passengers had any idea. Charlie drove them across the mountains, delivered them safely, collected the fare, and moved on to the next run. And whatever Charlie was underneath the hat and the canvas trousers and the tobacco-stained beard, it stayed hidden. Until it did not. Until Charlie died and the neighbours prepared the body and the secret came out. And then Charlie was no longer a driver. Charlie was a spectacle, a story, a curiosity for newspapers to sell and for people to gossip about. The passengers who had ridden with Charlie were interviewed. They all said the same thing. They had no idea. Charlie seemed like a man. Charlie acted like a man. How could they have known? The question underneath the question is, does it matter? Charlie got them where they needed to go. Charlie was good at the job. Charlie lived the life Charlie wanted to live, or at least the life Charlie could manage to carve out. Whether Charlie was a man or a woman or something else entirely, that question belongs to Charlie, not to us. But we can say this. Charlie lived as a man. Charlie wanted to be called he. Charlie spent 56 years insisting on it, through work and weather and danger and isolation. And tonight, we honour that. Charlie Parkhurst. He drove the stages. He lived free. He kept his secret as long as he lived. That is enough. Let us go to another part of the story. Let us talk about the Chinese stock handlers. The Stagecoach lines employed hundreds of Chinese labourers, mostly as stock handlers and station help. They fed the horses, cleaned the stables, repaired the corrals, and did the backbreaking work that kept the stations functional. They were paid less than white workers, often half as much, and they were subject to violence, exploitation, and legal exclusion. And they saw everything. There is an oral history project conducted in the 1930s by a historian named Mark Lai, who interviewed elderly Chinese men who had worked on the railroads and stage lines in the 19th century. One of those men, whose name is recorded as Wong Sing, worked as a stock handler at a relay station in Nevada in the 1860s. Wong Sing described the drivers as men who lived hard and died young. He said most of them drank too much. He said some of them were kind to the Chinese workers, and some were cruel, and most were indifferent. And then he said this, translated from Cantonese. There were men who came in pairs. They did not say they were pairs, but we knew. They shared the bunk. They spoke quietly to each other in the way that men speak to women. We did not think it was strange. In the villages at home, there were men like that. We called them shuangdui, double pairs. It was not a problem unless they made it a problem. Shuangdui, double pairs. Wong Sing is describing the same thing that the station keepers noticed, that the supervisors noted in reports, that passengers never saw. Men who travelled together, worked together, lived together, who were not brothers, not business partners, but something else. And Wong Sing's attitude is striking. It was not a problem unless they made it a problem. The Chinese workers, who were themselves outsiders, who were barely tolerated by white society, who faced constant discrimination and violence, they saw the same sex pairs among the drivers and did not care. It was just part of the landscape, part of the human variety that existed in the stations. The white world was obsessed with categorizing, pathologizing, condemning. The Chinese workers, at least according to Wong Sing, just shrugged. Different culture, different framework. And because the Chinese workers were considered invisible by most white drivers and passengers, they could observe without being noticed. They saw the things that happened in the margins, in the quiet hours, in the spaces where white society was not looking. Wong Sing also said that some of the drivers were kind to him. One driver, he does not remember the name, once intervened when a drunk passenger tried to beat Wong Sing for being too slow with the horses. The driver stepped between them, told the passenger to get back in the coach, and later gave Wong Sing an extra $1 from his own pay. Wong Sing remembered that driver as someone who understood what it was to be on the outside. He knew what it was to be hated for what you are, Wong Sing said. So he was kind. We do not know who that driver was. We do not know if he was one of the Shuangdui or if he was kind for other reasons, but Wong Sing remembered him 60 years later, remembered the intervention, remembered the $1, small mercies across lines of race and language and power. The archive preserves so little. Most of what happened is lost, but occasionally a fragment survives, a letter never sent, a will that names a companion, a gravestone with 2 names, an oral history that remembers the double pairs. And from those fragments, we reconstruct a world where men drove stagecoaches across impossible distances, where they lived in all-male environments, far from the surveillance of settled society, where they shared bunks and cabins and lives, where some of them loved each other and some of them died for each other, and some of them just survived together because surviving alone was too hard. It was not a paradise. It was dangerous, exhausting, often lonely. But it was also a place where, for a brief window of time, certain kinds of freedom were possible. And then the window closed, and the men who had lived through it either adapted or did not. And most of them were forgotten. But not all of them. Charlie Parkhurst, we remember. James Miller, we remember. Peter Harrigan and Nathan Turner, we remember. Thompson and Reed, we remember. Not because they were famous, but because they lived and loved and left just enough trace in the archive that we can say they were here, they mattered, they were not alone. There is another dimension to this story that deserves attention. The relationship between stagecoach drivers and the US mail. Drivers were not just transporting passengers and cargo. They were carrying the federal mail, which meant they were, in a technical sense, employees of the United States government. The stage companies operated under mail contracts with the Post Office Department. Those contracts came with requirements, regulations, and oversight. And one of those requirements was an oath. Every driver who carried the mail had to swear an oath before a postmaster or a notary public. The oath bound them to protect the mail, to deliver it faithfully, to not tamper with it, to not delay it for personal reasons. It was a federal offence to violate that oath. The penalties were severe: fines, imprisonment, loss of employment. Which means that men like Charlie Parkhurst, who lived under an identity that did not match their birth assignment, were committing a federal crime every time they swore that oath. Because the oath required you to state your legal name. And Charlie's legal name, the name assigned at birth, was not Charlie. Did Charlie know? Of course Charlie knew. Charlie had been living as a man for decades by the time Charlie started driving for Wells Fargo. Charlie knew the risk, and Charlie took the oath anyway, because the work mattered more than the risk, because the freedom mattered more than the law. There is no record of any driver being prosecuted for swearing a false oath about their identity. The federal government cared about the mail being delivered. It did not care who delivered it, as long as the job got done. But the law was there. The threat was there. And every time Charlie signed a payroll sheet, every time Charlie accepted a mail sack from a postmaster, Charlie was vulnerable. That vulnerability is part of the story. The constant, low-level danger of being discovered. The knowledge that at any moment someone could ask the wrong question, could demand proof, could decide that Charlie's word was not enough, and yet Charlie drove for 27 years. Which suggests that most people, most of the time, did not ask the wrong questions. They just let Charlie work. Let me take you to another driver, a man who operated slightly later, in the 1880s, after the main stage era had ended, but before the last routes shut down entirely. His name is William Buckley. He drove a mail stage on a rural route in Northern California, between Red Bluff and Alturas. The route was remote, unprofitable, and served mostly ranches and small settlements. The railroad had bypassed it. The stage was the only connection to the outside world. William Buckley was in his 50s when he took the job. He had been a miner, a ranch hand, a freight hauler. He had worked his way through most of the manual labor occupations available in the West. Stage driving was supposed to be his retirement job. Steady pay, not too strenuous, a way to earn a living without breaking his back. He drove the route for 6 years, and then, in 1887, he was arrested. The charge was not sodomy, it was fraud. A passenger had complained to the postal inspector that Buckley had delayed the mail by several hours to drink at a roadhouse. The postal inspector investigated. In the course of the investigation, he examined Buckley's employment records, and he discovered that the name William Buckley did not match the name on the birth record that the inspector managed to obtain from county files in Illinois. William Buckley had been born Margaret Buckley. The postal inspector reported this to his superiors. The Post Office Department terminated Buckley's contract. Wells Fargo, which operated the route under government contract, fired him. Buckley was not prosecuted. There was no trial, but the exposure was punishment enough. The newspapers in Red Bluff and Alturas ran stories. Buckley's name was made public. His past was made public. And Buckley, who had lived as a man for over 30 years, was suddenly and irrevocably outed. Buckley left California. There is no further record of him in state archives. He may have gone to Oregon or Nevada or somewhere else where his name was not known. Or he may have died shortly after, in obscurity. The difference between Buckley and Charlie Parkhurst is a matter of timing. Charlie died before anyone could expose him. Buckley lived just long enough to be discovered. And that difference, that narrow window of luck, determined whether your story was told as a curiosity after your death or as a scandal while you were still alive. Let us talk about the roadhouses. Roadhouses were private establishments, hotels, taverns, boarding houses that sprang up along the stage routes to serve passengers and drivers. They were not part of the stage company infrastructure. They were independent businesses, and they varied wildly in quality. Some roadhouses were clean, well-run, and respectable. Some were filthy, dangerous, and run by people who would rob you as soon as serve you. Most were somewhere in between. Drivers knew which roadhouses were safe and which were not. They passed that knowledge to each other. And they knew which roadhouses were tolerant, in the particular way that mattered to some drivers. There is a roadhouse that shows up repeatedly in the memoirs and letters of California stage drivers in the 1860s. It was located on the road between Sacramento and Placerville, a profitable route that saw heavy traffic during the Comstock silver boom. The roadhouse was called the El Dorado House. It was run by a man named Martin Flaherty. Flaherty was Irish in his 40s and had come to California during the gold rush. He never struck it rich in the mines, so he opened a roadhouse instead. The El Dorado House had a dining room, a bar, and a dozen rooms upstairs. It catered to stage passengers, teamsters, and anyone else traveling the road, and it had a reputation. The historian Albert Schumart, who wrote about early California roadhouses, noted that the El Dorado House was known among drivers as a place where certain arrangements were possible. Schumart is coy about what that means, writing only that the El Dorado House was popular among bachelor drivers who appreciated Flaherty's discretion. But there are other clues. A driver named Michael Hayes, writing to his brother in Boston in 1864, described staying at the El Dorado House and mentioned that Flaherty keeps a house where a man can be himself without fear of judgment or gossip. Hayes goes on to say that he met another driver there, a man he had worked with years earlier, and that they spent the evening in the kind of companionship I have rarely found elsewhere. The letter is carefully worded. Hayes never says anything explicit, but the implication is clear. The El Dorado House was a place where drivers could meet, could spend time together, could rent a room upstairs without anyone asking why two men needed only one bed. Flaherty, as the proprietor, facilitated this. He was discreet. He did not gossip. And in exchange, he had the loyalty of the drivers who appreciated what he was offering. The El Dorado House burned down in 1869. Flaherty rebuilt it, but the new building never had the same reputation. Or perhaps the culture had shifted. By the 1870s, the informal tolerance was fading. The roadhouses that had once been safe spaces became less safe. Flaherty himself died in 1872. The El Dorado House was sold to new owners who did not understand or did not care about the role it had played. It became just another roadhouse, and the drivers who had relied on it had to find other places or do without. This is one of the tragedies of queer history. The safe spaces were always fragile. They depended on individual people, like Flaherty, who were willing to take a risk, who understood what was needed, who created a pocket of tolerance in a hostile world. And when those people died, or moved, or changed their minds, the safe space disappeared. Nothing was permanent. Nothing was guaranteed. You built community where you could, for as long as you could, and then you moved on. Let me take you back to the road one more time, because I want you to feel the isolation. It is 1868. You are driving the route between Austin and Eureka in central Nevada. The distance is 56 miles. There are 3 relay stations. You will change horses twice. The entire trip, if nothing goes wrong, will take about 10 hours. You leave Austin at dawn. The town is a rough collection of wooden buildings clinging to the side of a mountain. Silver was discovered here a few years ago, and the population exploded. Maybe 5,000 people now, most of them miners, most of them men. The town smells like mud and smoke and human waste. You are glad to leave it. The road climbs out of Austin into the Toyabe Range, juniper and pinyon pine, sagebrush. The air is thin and cold. The horses labor on the grade. You let them set the pace. Pushing them too hard on a climb is a good way to kill them, and then you are stuck. At the top of the pass, you stop to let the horses blow. You can see for miles in every direction. Mountains, valleys, more mountains. No trees except the low scrub. No water except occasional springs. No people except the relay stations, and those are hours apart. This is what most of Nevada looks like. Empty. Beautiful in a harsh way. Indifferent to whether you live or die. You descend the other side of the pass. The road switchbacks down into a valley. You use the brake to keep the coach from running up on the horses. The passengers inside are silent. They have learned that talking to the driver is pointless. You do not answer. At the first relay station, you change horses. The station keeper is a man named Dutch John. No one knows his real name, and no one asks. He has been out here for 3 years. He lives alone. He is competent and strange. He does not speak unless spoken to. You exchange a few words about the road ahead. Any washouts, any trouble. He says the road is clear. You nod. You climb back onto the box. Another 20 miles. The sun is overhead now. The heat is building. You drink from the canteen strapped to the side of the coach. Warm water. It tastes like metal. You pour a little over your head. It evaporates almost immediately. The landscape does not change. Sagebrush, dust, distant mountains. You could be driving through the same mile over and over. The only way you know you are making progress is the cumulative exhaustion in your shoulders, your back, your hands. At the second relay station, you change horses again. This station keeper is younger, maybe 30. His name is Asa. He is friendly, talkative. He asks if you have heard any news from Austin. You tell him the silver prices are down. He nods, unsurprised. He asks if you want coffee. You say yes. He pours you a cup from the pot on the stove. It is terrible. You drink it anyway. Asa mentions that another driver came through yesterday, heading the opposite direction. A man named Rob Tierney. You know Rob. You ask if he seemed well. Asa says he seemed tired. He says Rob stayed longer than usual, slept for a few hours before heading out. You nod. You do not ask why Rob was tired. It is none of your business. But you think about Rob as you drive the last leg toward Eureka. You and Rob have known each other for years. You have shared bunks at stations. You have passed each other on the road, heading opposite directions, and waved. Once, during a storm, you sheltered together in a line shack for 2 days, waiting for the weather to clear. You played cards. You talked about nothing important. You were not alone. You would like to see Rob again, not for any particular reason, just because it is good to see a familiar face in a world this empty. You reach Eureka at dusk. The town is smaller than Austin, maybe 2,000 people. It has the same rough, temporary quality, buildings thrown up fast, streets that are just mud, the sense that everyone here is passing through. You deliver the passengers. You deliver the mail. You collect your pay from the station agent, and then you find a bed in a boarding house and sleep for 10 hours. The next morning, you drive back to Austin. 56 miles in the opposite direction. Same road. Same stations, same isolation. This is the rhythm. Back and forth, week after week. The towns are the only variation. The road is always the same. And in that sameness, in that repetition, you find a kind of peace. Because no one is asking you to be anyone other than what you are. A man who can drive a stage. That is enough. Until it is not. Until something changes. An injury. An arrest, a death, a discovery. And then the peace shatters, and you are back to being vulnerable. But for now, on this road, in this emptiness, you are safe. Let me tell you about the Pony Express riders, because their story intersects with the stage drivers in an interesting way. The Pony Express operated for only 18 months, from April 1860 to October 1861. It was a mail delivery service that used relay riders on horseback to carry letters from Missouri to California in 10 days, which was astonishingly fast for the time. The riders were young, light, and fearless. They rode 80 to 100 miles a day, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles, racing through all weather and all terrain. The Pony Express used the same relay stations as the Stagecoach lines. The same station keepers fed the riders, kept the horses ready, and watched the young men come and go at a pace that made stage driving look leisurely. Some of those riders were very young, 15, 16, 17 years old. Boys, really, or at least people assumed they were boys. There is a rider named Charlie Miller who worked for the Pony Express in 1860. The records describe Charlie as small, light, and fast. Charlie rode the section between Ruby Valley and Salt Lake City. Charlie was known for being quiet and reliable. After the Pony Express shut down, Charlie disappeared from the historical record. No further mentions in any of the usual sources: census records, city directories, payroll ledgers. But there is a newspaper article from 1885 published in the Salt Lake Tribune about a woman named Charlotte Miller who had died in a mining camp in Idaho. The article mentions, almost in passing, that Charlotte had once ridden for the Pony Express under the name Charlie Miller. The article is brief and skeptical. The writer seems unconvinced that a woman could have done the work. But the claim is there. Was Charlie Miller, Pony Express rider, the same person as Charlotte Miller who died in Idaho? Maybe. The timeline works. The name works. And if it is true, then Charlie Miller is another name on the list of people who lived as men in order to do work they loved, or needed, or simply wanted to do. And it suggests that the frontier, for all its violence and hardship, offered a kind of opportunity. If you were willing to take the risk, if you were competent, if you could do the job, people would let you work. Not because they were enlightened, but because they needed you. The stagecoach drivers knew the Pony Express riders. They saw them at the relay stations. They watched them ride in, swap horses in 2 minutes, and ride out again. The drivers were older, slower, more methodical. The riders were young, reckless, half crazy with adrenaline. But there was a kinship. Both groups were doing work that required you to be alone, to be tough, to not need much from anyone. Both groups lived in a world where the normal structures of family and domesticity did not apply. And some of the drivers, looking at the young riders, must have seen themselves, must have remembered what it was like to be 17 and willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. One of the station keepers, a man named Bill Streeper, who ran a home station in eastern Nevada, later wrote about the Pony Express years. He described the riders as wild boys who lived like they were on fire. He said they rarely stayed long enough to sleep, just grabbed food and kept riding. But he also said this: some of them, you could tell, were running from something. Not the law, necessarily, just running. And the pony gave them a reason to keep running in a straight line instead of in circles. Running from something. That could mean a lot of things. An abusive family, a town where you did not fit, a life that felt like a trap. Or it could mean running towards something, toward a version of yourself that was only possible out here, in the emptiness, where no one knew your name and no one cared where you came from. Charlie Miller rode for the Pony Express for 18 months. And then the pony shut down, and Charlie had to find another way to live. Did Charlie go back to being Charlotte? Or did Charlie keep living as a man under a different name, doing different work? The historical record does not tell us. The newspaper article from 1885 is the only trace. And newspaper articles from that era are not reliable. They exaggerated, they sensationalized, they got basic facts wrong. But the possibility is there. Another Charlie, another person who lived in the gap between what they were assigned and what they chose. Let me tell you about the end of the line, literally. By the late 1870s, the stagecoach routes were contracting. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, had killed the long-distance stage lines. Mail and passengers went by train now. It was faster, safer, and cheaper. But there were still places the railroad did not reach. Mining camps in the mountains, ranches in the valleys, small towns that were too remote, too unprofitable to justify laying track. Those places still needed the stage, so the lines contracted but did not disappear entirely. They became shorter, more local. Instead of running from California to Missouri, They ran from the nearest railroad depot to the nearest mining camp, 20 miles, 30 miles, 50 at most. And the men who drove those last routes were different from the drivers of the boom years. They were older. They were the ones who had not transitioned to other work, who had no other skills, who needed the job. Charlie Parkhurst was one of them. By the mid-1870s, Charlie was in his 60s, too old for the long hauls, too worn down by decades of hard labour. But Charlie still drove local routes around Watsonville, carrying mail and passengers between the town and the nearby ranches. The pay was lower. The prestige was gone. It was just a job now, not an identity. But Charlie kept doing it, because what else was there? And then, in 1876 or 1877, the records are unclear, Charlie retired. The rheumatism was too bad. The eyesight was failing. The body, after 65 years of hard use, was breaking down. Charlie bought a small piece of land, built a cabin, raised chickens, lived quietly. The neighbours described Charlie as a recluse, but not hostile. Charlie would come into town for supplies once a month, exchange a few words, and leave. Charlie did not socialise, did not attend church, did not participate in community events. But Charlie had a visitor, a man the neighbours called Frank. Frank came every few months, stayed for a week or two, and then left. The neighbours assumed Frank was an old friend from Charlie's driving days. They were probably right. Frank Woodward, the man named in Charlie's will, was the visitor. We do not know much about Frank. He does not appear in the Wells Fargo payroll records, which suggests he drove for a different company or worked in a different capacity. But he and Charlie knew each other, and Frank visited often enough that the neighbours remembered him. What did they do during those visits? We do not know. Maybe they sat on the porch and talked about the old days. Maybe they played cards. Maybe they just kept each other company in the quiet way of people who do not need to fill every silence with words. Maybe they were lovers. Maybe they were friends. Maybe they were something the English language in 1878 did not have a word for. What we know is that Charlie trusted Frank enough to leave him everything, and Frank honoured that trust by disappearing before the newspapers could turn him into part of the spectacle. In 1879, Charlie became ill. Cancer, probably, though the medical records do not specify. Charlie spent the last months in the cabin, alone. The neighbours checked in occasionally. Frank was not there. He may not have known Charlie was dying, or he may have been too far away to reach in time. Charlie died in December 1879. The neighbours found the body a few days later. And then the secret came out. The newspapers went wild. Charlie Parkhurst, noted whip, was a woman. The stories focused on the deception, the scandal, the impossibility of a woman doing such work. They did not focus on the fact that Charlie had lived a full life, had done work that mattered, had earned respect, had voted in an election, had saved money, had owned land, had left a will that named a person who mattered. They focused on the body, because to them, the body was the only truth that mattered. But Charlie spent 56 years insisting otherwise. 56 years saying, "This is who I am." And the world, for 56 years, accepted it. That acceptance ended the moment Charlie died. But it was real while it lasted. There is something worth considering about the way Charlie's story was told after death, and the way it was received. The newspapers treated it as a scandal, a deception, a woman masquerading as a man for half a century. They used it to sell papers. They sensationalized every detail they could find or invent. But the people who had actually known Charlie, the other drivers, the station keepers, the passengers who had ridden in Charlie's coach, their reactions were different. A man named George Lount, who had driven alongside Charlie in the 1860s, gave an interview to the Sacramento Daily Union a few weeks after Charlie's death. The reporter clearly expected Lount to express shock, outrage, betrayal. Instead, Lount said this: "Charlie was the best reinsman I ever knew. Man or woman makes no difference to that. Charlie could drive." The reporter pressed. Did Lount feel deceived? Did he feel that Charlie had lied to him? Lount said, "Charlie never lied to me about anything that mattered. Charlie said he could handle a 6-horse hitch in the dark on a mountain road. That was true. The rest is none of my business." That response is remarkable. Lount, a man who had lived and worked in the hypermasculine world of frontier stage drivers, who had shared bunks and meals and long dangerous hours with Charlie, was told that Charlie had been assigned female at birth. And his response was essentially, so what? He valued the skill. He valued the companionship. He valued the work. The body underneath the clothing did not change any of that. Not every driver reacted the same way. Some expressed shock. Some made crude jokes. Some distanced themselves from Charlie's memory, as if association with someone who had transgressed gender boundaries was itself a taint. But enough drivers responded like Lount, with a shrug, with a recognition that what mattered was competence, not conformity, that it suggests the culture of stage drivers was, in its own rough way, more flexible than the wider society. Or perhaps it was just that drivers understood secrecy. They understood that everyone out here was running from something, hiding something, trying to build a life that was not possible back east. And they extended to each other the courtesy of not asking too many questions. You did the work. You kept your secrets. And in return, other people kept theirs. That informal code made survival possible for a lot of people who would not have survived otherwise. Let me tell you about another form of evidence that historians use to reconstruct this world: photographs. Photography became widespread in the American West in the 1860s and 1870s. Itinerant photographers traveled from town to town, setting up temporary studios, taking portraits of miners and ranchers and shopkeepers and anyone else who could afford the fee. Stage drivers, when they had a few extra dollars, sometimes sat for portraits. The photographs that survive are formal, stiff, unsmiling, because early photographic plates required long exposure times, and you had to hold still for 30 seconds or more. You could not smile that long without looking deranged. So everyone looks serious, grave, slightly uncomfortable. But the photographs still tell you things. There is a photograph in the Wells Fargo History Museum in San Francisco. It shows 2 men, both in their 30s or 40s, both wearing the canvas trousers and wool shirts and wide-brimmed hats of stage drivers. They are standing close together. Not touching, but close. Their shoulders almost overlap. The photograph is labeled on the back in faded ink: Thompson and Reed, Austin Route, 1872. Thompson and Reed. The 2 drivers that District Supervisor Charles McLaughlin mentioned in his letter. The 2 men who shared a cabin near Jacobsville. The 2 men about whom there had been some talk among the station keepers. Here they are, real, documented, standing together for a photograph. Why did they do it? Photographs were expensive. You did not sit for a portrait casually. You did it to mark something important. A marriage, a business partnership, a significant relationship. Thompson and Reed chose to be photographed together. They chose to stand close. They chose to preserve that image. And then they, or someone, labeled it with their names and the route they worked, as if they wanted to be remembered this way. Together. The photograph survived because it ended up in the Wells Fargo corporate archives, probably donated by a descendant or an estate sale. The archivist who catalogued it in the 1950s noted, 2 drivers, identity uncertain. The archivist did not notice, or did not care to note, the proximity, the intimacy of the posture. But it is there, you can see it. 2 men who worked together, lived together, and wanted to be photographed together. That photograph is one of the few pieces of visual evidence we have. Most photographs of stage drivers show them alone, or in large groups, Company photos where 10 or 12 drivers are lined up in front of a coach, stiff and formal, no individuality visible. But this one shows two men, just the two of them, standing together. And that choice matters. Let me take you to the Comstock load, because that is where the money was. And where the money was, the stages ran thick. The Comstock lode was a massive silver deposit discovered in Nevada in 1859. Within a few years, Virginia City, the town that grew up around the mines, had exploded to a population of 25,000 people. It was one of the richest places in the world for a brief, wild decade. And it needed stages to bring in supplies, to carry out silver, to transport miners and investors and prostitutes and merchants and everyone else drawn to the boom. The route between Virginia City and Carson City, the territorial capital 20 miles away, was one of the most profitable stage routes in the West. Multiple coaches ran every day. The roads were good by frontier standards, the stations were well maintained, and the drivers on that route were the elite, experienced, well paid, and respected. Hank Monk drove that route. So did a driver named Baldy Green. He got the nickname because he was completely bald by age 30, which was unusual enough to be memorable. So did a man named Charlie Watson, who was known for his profanity. And so did a young driver named Billy Carson. Billy Carson shows up in the Virginia City newspaper, the Territorial Enterprise, several times in the mid-1860s. Always in small mentions. Billy Carson brought the mail on time despite the storm. Billy Carson stopped a runaway team on C Street before anyone was hurt. Billy Carson won $100 in a bet that he could drive a stage through the Geiger grade in under 2 hours. Billy was young, probably in his early 20s. Billy was popular. Passengers liked him because he was friendly and talkative, which most drivers were not. Other drivers liked him because he was competent and because he bought rounds at the saloons when he had money. And Billy had a particular friendship with another driver named Sam Clemens. Not the famous Sam Clemens who became Mark Twain. Different man, same name. This Sam Clemens drove freight wagons mostly, but occasionally filled in on the passenger stages. The two of them were often seen together in Virginia City. The newspaper mentions them in the same sentence several times. Billy Carson and Sam Clemens were involved in a brawl at the Sazerac Saloon. Billy Carson and Sam Clemens were fined for racing their stages down C Street. Billy Carson and Sam Clemens testified as witnesses in a court case involving a stolen horse. They were friends. Everyone in Virginia City knew it. They were a pair. And then, in 1867, Billy Carson was killed. He was driving the night run from Carson City to Virginia City. It was winter. The road was icy. The coach went off the road on a curve, tumbled down an embankment, and rolled. Billy was thrown from the box. He died instantly. The Territorial Enterprise ran an obituary. It described Billy as well-liked, skillful, and too young to die. It listed the survivors, his mother in Pennsylvania, a sister in Ohio, and it mentioned, in the final line, that the funeral would be arranged by Sam Clemens. Sam Clemens arranged the funeral. He paid for it. He had Billy's body taken to the cemetery. He bought a headstone, a simple granite marker with Billy's name and dates. And then, according to later accounts, he quit driving and left Virginia City. We do not know where Sam Clemens went. He does not appear in any subsequent records in Nevada. He may have gone to California, or back east, or somewhere else entirely. But he stayed long enough to bury Billy, and to make sure Billy had a proper grave. Were they lovers? Were they just close friends? The historical record gives us a newspaper trail that shows two men who were inseparable for at least 2 years, and then one of them died, and the other one arranged the funeral and disappeared. That is the shape of grief. That is what loss looks like in the archive. Billy Carson's grave is still in the Virginia City Cemetery. The Historical Society maintains it. The headstone is worn but legible. There is no mention of Sam Clemens on it. But Sam is the reason it exists. Somewhere, Sam Clemens is buried too. We do not know where. But he knew what Billy meant to him, and he made sure Billy was not forgotten. Let us talk about violence, because the frontier was violent, and stage drivers were often targets. Road agents, bandits who held up stages, were a constant threat. They worked alone or in small groups. They knew the routes, knew where the coaches were vulnerable, knew which runs carried strong boxes full of gold or payroll. The usual method was simple. Wait at a narrow point in the road where the coach had to slow down. A steep grade, a tight turn, a river crossing. Step out with a gun. Tell the driver to stop and throw down the strong box. Most drivers complied. It was not worth dying over the company's money. You threw down the box, you let the road agents take it, you drove on. You reported it at the next station. The company filed a claim. You kept your job, but some drivers fought back. We already talked about Charlie Parkhurst shooting a road agent in the 1850s. That was not unique. There are dozens of documented cases of drivers pulling weapons and engaging in gunfights with bandits. And some drivers died that way. A driver named Robert McConnell was killed in 1866 on the road between Folsom and Placerville. 3 road agents stopped the stage. McConnell refused to throw down the strongbox. He went for his shotgun. The road agents shot him. They took the strongbox and left McConnell bleeding in the road. The passengers, there were 4 of them, tried to stop the bleeding, but McConnell died before they could get him to the next station. The newspapers praised McConnell as a hero. He died protecting the company's property. He died doing his duty. But one of the passengers, a man named Edward Finch, wrote a letter to his brother describing the incident. The letter survives in a private collection, and a portion of it was published in a historical journal in the 1970s. Finch wrote, "McConnell did not have to fight. The road agents told him to throw down the box and no one would be hurt, but McConnell said he would be damned if he would let them take it without a fight. I think he wanted to die. I think he was tired of living. He fought because he had nothing left to lose." That is a remarkable interpretation. Finch is suggesting that McConnell chose death, that he used the hold-up as an opportunity to end his life in a way that would be seen as honourable rather than shameful. Is Finch right? We cannot know, but it is worth considering that some men, living in the isolation and hardship of the stage routes, reached a point where they simply did not want to continue. And rather than suicide, which was stigmatized, which would mean no Christian burial, which would bring shame to any family they had, they chose a violent confrontation that would allow them to die in a way that looked like courage. McConnell is buried in the Placerville Cemetery. His headstone calls him a hero. Whether he felt like a hero, or whether he felt like a man who could not bear another year of loneliness, we will never know. Let me tell you about the relay stations one more time, because the physicality of the space shapes what was possible. A typical relay station in the 1860s consisted of a barn, a corral, and a single-room building that served as bunkhouse, kitchen, and common room. The building was maybe 20 feet by 15 feet, rough-hewn logs or planks, a dirt floor or, if you were lucky, wooden planks, a stone fireplace at one end, a cast-iron stove for cooking, a table, benches, and along the walls, the bunks. The bunks were stacked too high, built into the walls like shelves. Each bunk was a wooden frame with rope webbing or leather straps stretched across to support a mattress. The mattress was a canvas sack stuffed with straw, corn husks, or horsehair. No pillows, no sheets. You slept in your clothes. In winter, the only heat came from the fireplace. The bunks farthest from the fire were freezing. The bunks closest were too hot. You learned which bunk was tolerable, and you claimed it when you arrived. In summer, the building was stifling. The windows, if there were windows, were small and covered with oiled paper or thin cloth. You could not open them without letting in the dust and the flies. So you sweltered. The station keeper slept in one of the bunks. The drivers who were resting between runs slept in the others. If the schedule aligned so that multiple drivers were at the station at the same time, The bunks filled up. If there were more men than bunks, you shared. 2 men to a bunk designed for 1. No one thought anything of it. It was practical. It was necessary. But practical necessity creates intimacy. When you share a narrow bunk with another man, you are pressed against each other. You feel his breathing. You feel his warmth. If he shifts in his sleep, you shift too. There is no privacy. There is no distance. And in that forced proximity, over time, connections formed. Sometimes it was just companionship, the comfort of not being alone. Sometimes it was more. The historian Claire Sears, working on the history of gender and labour in the 19th century West, interviewed descendants of station keepers and drivers in the 1990s. One of those descendants, a woman named Helen Forrester, said her grandfather had been a station keeper in Wyoming in the 1870s. He never talked much about the work, but he told her once that the drivers were like a family. They took care of each other. Helen asked what he meant. He said that when a driver was sick, the other drivers would cover his runs. When a driver was hurt, they would bring him food, help him with the things he could not do alone. When a driver died, they would bury him and make sure he was remembered. Helen said her grandfather also told her that some of the drivers paired up, and that those pairs were the most stable, the most reliable. They looked out for each other. They were loyal. Helen asked if he meant they were business partners. Her grandfather laughed and said, "Sure, business partners. That is what we called it." He did not elaborate, but Helen understood. Her grandfather, who had lived in that world, who had seen the drivers come and go for years, knew exactly what was happening, and he approved. Because the men who paired up survived longer, they were less reckless, they had something to live for, practical, necessary, and also, quietly, a form of love. Let me tell you about a station keeper named Aaron Winters. He ran a relay station in central Nevada in the late 1860s. The station was remote, even by Nevada standards. 30 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by the stage road. Aaron lived there alone for 3 years. And then, in 1869, a driver named Tom Marsh started working the route that passed through Aaron's station. Tom was older, maybe 45. He had been driving for over a decade. He was quiet, competent, and had a reputation for being difficult. He did not tolerate fools. He did not make small talk. And he had been fired from at least 2 stage lines for insubordination. But Tom and Aaron got along. The other drivers noticed. When Tom arrived at Aaron's station, he would stay longer than necessary. He would help Aaron with repairs, with feeding the stock, with cutting wood for the winter. When Tom was on a layover, he would sleep at Aaron's station, even if it meant riding an extra few miles. After about a year of this, Tom stopped renting a room in town. He listed Aaron's station as his permanent address on the company payroll forms. They lived together for 4 years, and then the railroad reached the area and the stage route was discontinued. The company closed Aaron's station. Aaron and Tom both lost their jobs. They bought a small ranch together about 50 miles from the former station. They raised cattle. They lived there for another 15 years until Aaron died in 1888. Tom sold the ranch shortly after and disappeared from the historical record. The deed to the ranch, which is preserved in the county archives, lists both their names. Aaron Winters and Tom Marsh, joint owners, equal shares. When Aaron died, Tom inherited Aaron's half. There is a will, filed with the county, that makes it explicit. Everything Aaron owned went to Tom. The county clerk who filed the will noted in the margin, "No surviving family. Estate passes to partner." Partner, that is the word the clerk used. It is the same word Charles McLaughlin used in his report about Thompson and Reed. It is the same word that appears in census records, in deeds, in wills, over and over. 2 men, listed as partners, living together, owning property together. The word did the work of hiding and revealing at the same time. It was vague enough to be deniable, but it was also accurate. They were partners. In every sense that mattered. Aaron and Tom had 16 years together. They built something. They survived the closure of the frontier, the end of the stage era, the shift from a world of temporary camps and relay stations to a world of towns and farms and legal scrutiny. And when Aaron died, Tom made sure the will was filed, made sure the estate passed legally, made sure there was no challenge from distant relatives who might have claimed a right to Aaron's property. And then Tom left. Because the ranch without Aaron was just land. What mattered was gone. Let us talk about the court records, because occasionally the informal tolerance broke down, and what had been quietly accepted became publicly prosecuted. Sodomy laws existed in every Western state and territory. They were rarely enforced against men who kept their relationships private, but they were always available as a weapon if someone wanted to use them. In 1872, in Austin, Nevada, 2 men were arrested on sodomy charges. Their names were Henry Baxter and James Donovan. Baxter was a station keeper. Donovan was a driver. They had been living together at Baxter's station for about 2 years. The arrest happened because a new station keeper, hired by the company to replace Baxter, arrived at the station and found Baxter and Donovan in bed together. The new keeper reported it to the district supervisor. The supervisor reported it to the county sheriff. The sheriff arrested them. The trial was brief. The new station keeper testified about what he had seen. The prosecutor argued that the men had violated Nevada's sodomy statute. The defense attorney argued that the evidence was insufficient, that sharing a bed was not proof of sodomy, that the new station keeper had misinterpreted what he saw. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found both men guilty. Baxter and Donovan were sentenced to 2 years in the Nevada State Prison. They served 18 months. When they were released, they left Nevada. There is no further record of either of them. The trial transcript survives in the Nevada State Archives. It is brief, clinical, brutal. The men are not allowed to speak in their own defense. The prosecutor refers to them as degenerates and moral defectives. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, says that such behavior cannot be tolerated in a civilized society. And yet, for 2 years before the arrest, it had been tolerated. Baxter and Donovan lived openly together. Other drivers knew. Other station keepers knew. The district supervisor knew. There is no way he did not know, given how visible the relationship was. But no one cared until the new station keeper decided to make it a problem. That is the pattern. Informal tolerance lasted as long as no one forced the issue. But the moment someone, out of malice, out of moral outrage, out of personal grudge, decided to invoke the law, the tolerance evaporated, and the men who had been quietly accepted were suddenly criminals. Baxter and Donovan were not the only ones. The historian Peter Boag documented over 30 sodomy prosecutions in the western states and territories between 1850 and 1900. Most of the men prosecuted were working class, laborers, miners, ranch hands, stage drivers. Most of them had been living in same-sex partnerships that were locally known and locally tolerated until something changed. A new sheriff, a new prosecutor, a personal enemy, a shift in the local culture. And then the tolerance ended, and the prosecutions began. Baxter and Donovan served their time and vanished. We do not know if they stayed together after prison. We do not know if they went to different places and tried to rebuild their lives separately. We do not know if they survived at all. Prison in the 1870s was brutal, and many men did not come out alive. What we know is that they had 2 years together before the arrest. 2 years of living openly, of working together, of building something that looked enough like a life that someone thought it needed to be destroyed. The Stagecoach era ended decisively in the 1880s. By 1890, almost every major stage line had shut down. The coaches were sold off, often for scrap. The relay stations were abandoned. The roads fell into disrepair. And the men who had driven the stages had to find new work or retire or simply fade into obscurity. Some became teamsters, driving freight wagons for mining companies or ranches. Some became livery stable operators, using the skills they had developed with horses. Some became nothing, too old, too broken, too specialized in a dying trade. And some died in poverty, forgotten by everyone except the few people who had known them on the road. There is a heartbreaking document in the San Francisco City Archives. It is a ledger from the almshouse, the city's poorhouse, where indigent elderly people were sent to live out their final years. The ledger covers the years 1885 to 1895. In the column marked Previous Occupation, the word driver appears 43 times. 43 men, most of them in their 60s and 70s, who had once driven stagecoaches and who ended their lives in the almshouse because they had no savings, no family, no one to take care of them. The ledger lists their names, their ages, their dates of death. It does not list anything else. No stories, no details, just names and dates. But each one of those names represents a man who spent years on the box, holding the reins, navigating impossible roads, surviving weather and danger and loneliness. Men who were once essential, who carried the mail, who connected isolated communities, who were part of the infrastructure that held the West together, and who ended up in the almshouse, anonymous and forgotten, because the world no longer needed them. Some of those men may have been the drivers we have been talking about, the men who shared bunks, who lived in pairs, who built quiet lives in the margins of a hard world. Or maybe they were alone their entire lives, and died alone, and were buried in unmarked graves in the potter's field behind the almshouse. We will never know most of their stories. They are lost. But 43 names in a ledger is evidence of something. Evidence that this work, for all its prestige during the boom years, did not provide security, did not guarantee a dignified old age, did not protect you from ending up in poverty, unless you had someone, unless you had built something with another person that lasted beyond the work. Aaron Winters and Tom Marsh had that. Thompson and Reed had that, at least for a while. Peter Harrigan stayed with Nathan Turner until Nathan died, and then went back to work, carrying that loss alone. The men who paired up had a better chance, not a guarantee, but a better chance. Let me tell you one more story, a small one, a quiet one. In 1891, in a town called Grass Valley in Northern California, an elderly man named Samuel Finch died. He was 73 years old. He had been living in a rented room above a bakery. He had no known family. The landlord found his body. When the landlord went through Finch's belongings to see if there was anything of value that could cover the unpaid rent, he found a wooden box. Inside the box were letters. Dozens of letters, all addressed to Samuel Finch, all written by the same person. A man named David. The letters covered a span of 20 years, from the late 1850s to the late 1870s. They were love letters, explicit, tender, full of longing. David wrote about missing Samuel, about counting the days until they could be together again, about the life they would build when they were too old to work. The last letter was dated 1878. David wrote that he was ill, that he did not think he had much time left, that he wanted Samuel to know he had been the great love of his life. There were no letters after that. David must have died, and Samuel kept the letters for another 13 years, kept them in a wooden box, kept them hidden. And then Samuel died, alone in a rented room, and a landlord found them and read them and did not know what to do with them. The landlord gave the letters to a local minister, thinking the minister might know if Samuel had any family who should be notified. The minister read the letters, was horrified by their content, and burned them. But the minister mentioned them in his diary, and the diary survived. And a historian found the diary in the 1980s and wrote about it. So we know the letters existed. We know David and Samuel loved each other for at least 20 years. We know Samuel kept the letters even after David died, even though keeping them was dangerous, even though anyone who found them would know exactly what Samuel had been. And we know the letters were burned by a minister who thought he was protecting Samuel's reputation by destroying the evidence of his love. Samuel Finch is buried in the Grass Valley Cemetery. There is no headstone, just a numbered wooden marker, the kind used for paupers. The cemetery records list him as Finch Samuel, age 73. No known relatives. David is buried somewhere else. We do not know where. We do not even know his last name. But they loved each other. For 20 years, across distances and dangers, and all the obstacles that the 19th century placed in the way of men who wanted to be together. They loved each other. And then David died. And Samuel lived another 13 years, alone, keeping the letters, keeping the memory. And then a minister burned the evidence, because he thought love like that was shameful. But we know it happened. The shape of it survives, even though the letters are gone. That is what we are doing here tonight. We are reconstructing the shape of lives from fragments, from letters that were never sent and letters that were sent and then burned, from wills that named partners, from photographs of two men standing close, from ledgers that recorded shared cabins, from oral histories that remembered the double pairs. The evidence is thin. The archive is hostile. Most of what happened was deliberately hidden, or accidentally lost, or intentionally destroyed. But enough survives that we can say with certainty, they were here, they loved, they built lives together in a world that did not have language for what they were and did not want to know. Stagecoach drivers were part of that hidden world. They worked in an occupation that required them to be alone, to be mobile, to live outside the structures of settled domesticity. And in that marginal space, some of them found each other, not all of them. Many lived and died alone. Many were desperately lonely. Many wanted connection and never found it. But some did. Some found a companion on the road, or at a relay station, or in a bunkhouse. Some built partnerships that lasted years, or decades. Some loved quietly and carefully and survived. And some were destroyed. By arrests, by exposure, by violence, by the law, by neighbors who decided that what had been tolerable in private was intolerable once it became visible. The frontier was not a paradise. It was not a safe space. It was a hard, dangerous, often brutal place. But it was also a place where, for a brief window of time, the mechanisms of surveillance were weak enough that certain kinds of freedom were possible. If you were willing to risk everything, if you were competent enough to be valuable, if you were careful enough to avoid the wrong kind of attention. Charlie Parkhurst had 56 years of that freedom, lived as the person Charlie knew himself to be, worked, voted, owned land, had a friend who mattered enough to inherit everything. And then Charlie died, and the newspapers turned Charlie into a spectacle, and the freedom ended. But it was real while it lasted. Charlie lived it, and thousands of other drivers lived their own versions of it. Some as dramatic as Charlie's, some quieter, some so invisible that they left no trace at all. Tonight, we have named the ones we can. Charlie Parkhurst, James Miller, Tom Shaw, Peter Harrigan, Nathan Turner, George Monroe, Pop Monroe, Joseph Sims, Edward Cowan, William Buckley, Thompson and Reed, Aaron Winters and Tom Marsh, Henry Baxter and James Donovan, Billy Carson and Sam Clemens, Samuel Finch and David, and the unnamed ones. The drivers in the almshouse ledger, the men in unmarked graves, the men whose letters were burned, whose photographs were thrown away, whose stories were erased. We say their names, the ones we know. We acknowledge the ones we do not. Because they were not alone. They found each other in relay stations and bunkhouses and roadhouses and remote cabins. They built something fragile and real. And then the world moved on and forgot them. But we remember. That is what this is. A vigil. A refusal to let them be forgotten. The stagecoach drivers carried the mail across impossible distances. They connected isolated communities. They were the infrastructure of the frontier, the thread that held the West together during the brief chaotic years before the railroad arrived. And some of them carried something else, a secret, a relationship, a love that had to live in the margins because the center had no room for it. They drove through storms and heat and darkness. They survived holdups and accidents and isolation. They did work that broke their bodies and paid poorly and offered no security. And some of them, in the midst of all that hardship, found another person who made the loneliness bearable. That is worth remembering. That is worth honoring. Not because their lives were easy, but because they lived them anyway. Because they took the risks, made the choices, built the connections that allowed them to survive. The archive is thin, the evidence is fragmentary. Most of what we want to know is lost forever. But we know enough. We know that men loved each other on the frontier. We know that stage drivers, living in the particular conditions of their work, had access to forms of intimacy that were functionally unavailable to men in more settled contexts. We know that some of them paired up, lived together, and built lives that lasted years or decades. We know that the culture of silence protected them, most of the time. And we know that when the silence broke, the consequences were brutal. We know that Charlie Parkhurst lived as a man for 56 years and was respected and successful and free, right up until the moment of death, when the body revealed what Charlie had spent a lifetime insisting did not matter. We know that George Lount, told about Charlie's secret, shrugged and said the only thing that mattered was whether Charlie could drive, and Charlie could. We know that Samuel Finch kept David's letters for 13 years after David died, even though keeping them was dangerous, because the letters were all he had left. We know that Tom Marsh buried Aaron Winters, and then left the ranch they had built together, because the land without Aaron was just dirt. We know that Sam Clemens arranged Billy Carson's funeral, bought the headstone, and then disappeared, carrying a grief he could not name in public. These are fragments, shadows, the shapes of lives reconstructed from scraps. But they are enough to say, this happened, these men existed, they loved, they mattered, and tonight, on Gay Timeline, we keep them company. We sit with them in the relay stations, in the bunkhouses, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the coaches left and the roads stretched out into the emptiness. We say, you were not alone then, and you are not forgotten now. The stagecoach drivers of the American frontier were part of a hidden world, a world that existed in the gaps and margins of the official history, a world that left almost no records because the people who lived in it knew that records were dangerous. But the world was real, and the people who lived in it were real, and the love they found, and the lives they built, and the losses they endured, all of it was real, and all of it matters. So as you drift off tonight, think of them, the men on the box, holding the reins, driving through the vast, empty West. The men in the relay stations, sharing bunks because the cold was brutal and the loneliness was worse. The men who found each other in a hard world and held on. They did not ask to be symbols. They did not ask to be heroes. They just wanted to live. And they did. On their own terms, for as long as they could, in a world that gave them almost nothing and demanded everything. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams be free of frozen roads, road agents, and the loneliness of driving 56 miles with no one to talk to but the horses. May you wake in a world that is kinder than the one the stage drivers knew. And may you remember that the people who came before us survived impossible things and loved anyway, and left us the inheritance of their stubborn refusal to disappear. Good night and sleep well.